Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa McClenahan, Executive Director and Counsel at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Walkerton's Drinking Water Protection Legacy. In this series, we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the contamination of Walkerton's water supply by speaking with the people who experienced the tragedy and the inquiry that followed firsthand. With me today is Paul Muldoon, who was the Executive Director and Counsel at the Canadian Environmental Law Association at the time of the Walkerton inquiry. Paul practiced environmental law for 22 years at NGOs, including CELA, and subsequently became a Vice Chair for the Environmental Review Tribunal of Ontario. Now Paul is a member of the Environmental Protection Tribunal of Canada. Welcome, Paul, and thanks for joining me today.
Hello.
So at the time that the concerned Walkerton citizens approached CELA and asked us to assist them, why did you think it was important to advise and represent the Walkerton citizens during the Walkerton inquiry?
I think it was really two things. One was that CELA had a long history with drinking water protection. Toby Weigott, for instance, wrote an article years before outlining the need for better drinking water protection in the province, and the clinic had much experience with problems of drinking water, and it was warnings gone unheeded. Mm-hmm. So it was really a good opportunity, I think, in that context for CELA to find a reason to highlight the problems. The second one was one of the really good attributes of CELA was this organizing ability. Here's a community that's totally under stress, had never obviously been in a situation like that. And I thought, along with my colleagues, that CELA had the tools, both legal and organizing tools, to help the community through this difficult time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, and I remember that well, and I remember them approaching us so early that we were able to help them get a letter in about the terms of reference of the inquiry and use that kind of systemic knowledge we had about the drinking water system to inform that. So what recollections stand out for you in thinking back to your time working on the Walkerton inquiry?
There was three of them. The first one was that when we initially met with them, and then we met with them regularly throughout the entire 2 years of inquiry, was that they took a very principled approach that they were not out for retribution. They were out to ensure that this tragedy would not be repeated through the betterment of strong laws and policies. And despite the fact that many people are still ill, despite the fact they're in the midst of this enormous tragedy in a very small community, that principled approach, that principled outlook was just omnipresent, whether it was talking to a person in the street or during a meeting of the entire community. That was the key theme. The key instruction we received was, do what you can, not only to find out what happened, but to make sure this does not happen again. And that really stuck in my mind of just how incredibly full of integrity that community was. Because if I was there as a community member, I'd probably be thinking a lot of things but that. But they were so determined to give us those instructions to make this, to create a legacy, a positive legacy of Walkerton. That Walkerton wouldn't be known for its tragedy, but known for the fact that it would form the basis of a very strong legal and policy framework to protect Ontario drinking water. Mm-hmm. The second aspect, I guess, or thing that left was, of course, the dedication of the community in terms of working together and working thoughtfully, not only within Walkerton, but in the second part of the inquiry, which was the policy part. And after the first part was over, which dealt with the causes of the tragedy, they could have easily just said, forget it, we're done. But mm-hmm. Instead they stuck it through, and they stuck it through for years after. So even though this is the 20th anniversary, I know that that community has worked very hard to maintain the gains that were gotten at the time, but more importantly, to remind everyone about the importance of of strong laws to protect the environment and particularly drinking water.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So what do you think now, 20 years later and looking back, were some of the most significant results and recommendations of the Walkerton inquiry?
Well, I think the obvious ones is, we have a Clean Water Act and a Safe Drinking Water Act and a bunch of policies. And a lot of the, ironically thing, a lot of the things that CELA had recommended 20 years before
Mm-hmm.
were part of the actual results. And I think that's because CELA had already thought through a lot of the solutions and needs to protect drinking water. But I think that the legacies in my mind, or the sort of things that still resonate, is the power of the community, the power of people, day-to-day people who realize what's going on. And we've got to remember that Walkerton occurred after there were significant reductions in the environmental budget, deregulation, and again, the community was apolitical. It wasn't concerned about the politics. It was concerned about the environmental infrastructure being recreated and rebuilt. And there's many groups, health, environment, and other groups that warned about the problems of lack of funding. But at the end of the day, it was a small community in Ontario that not only highlighted the problem, but actually worked so hard to ensure that funding was restored, infrastructure was rebuilt, and we still have that community today to think about it. So I would say it goes back to the power of grassroots communities to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, that's great. So looking forward, what do you hope will not be forgotten in terms of the lessons we learned during the Walkerton inquiry and Justice O'Connor's reports? And do you think we're at any danger of forgetting those lessons now, 20 years later?
Well, there's a few things. One is that we always seem to take drinking water for granted. We always seem to take the basic things, the clean air, and those kind of things we take for granted. And we realize that there's so many people that work, public health inspectors and environmental NGOs, et cetera, that work hard to remind us that these are fundamental to the human condition and that they cost money to maintain. It takes resources to promote them. And so even though the economy is struggling, even though there's lots of other priorities, we cannot forget these priorities, because this is what happens when things do fall through the cracks, when things are underfunded, when things are deregulated. Our basic needs, drinking water, is at risk. So and it's hard sometimes to remind the public how important these things are. And unfortunately, and I say that many times underlined, it took a tragedy to remind us of that. So that is one of the legacies, that when we say Walkerton, what we mean is we have to make sure that our basic needs are met. And it's those people in Walkerton that is a source of a constant reminder that we have to resource and ensure the adequate framework for protection of our basic needs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, and Walkerton, I think one of the startling things that we found out is it could have happened in any number of communities around the province because of the fraying of that safety net and the complacency that Justice O'Connor told us had occurred in drinking water. So I think that's a great thing to highlight. So thank you, Paul. This is one of a short series titled Walkerton's Drinking Water Protection Legacy, curated by CELA, to be housed on the CELA Foundation's environmental history pages. In this series, we focus on the essential lessons learned from one of our significant CELA cases, the Walkerton inquiry, and how to ensure drinking water protection and environmental protection is safeguarded into the future. Paul Muldoon was Executive Director and part of the legal team representing the citizens during the Walkerton inquiry. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.